was an auto worker, still is, and Frances, until her retirement, was a nurse and a union leader. Now, in reviewing Frances's life, I want to see if I can bring out what it tells us about her, but also about the party that she chose to join. As you can tell from that brief interview, she was a very political person. So let me first give some of the personal details of her life. She was born in 1928. That was just before, 1 year before the big financial crash and the beginning of the Great Depression. Her parents were Jewish immigrants from Poland. They lived in Brighton Beach, which at that time was a largely Jewish immigrant community in Brooklyn. And like so many other working-class Jewish refugees from war-torn Europe, war-torn from World War I when they left, they were communists, her parents. So and you can get some of the hints about this from this interview, but I'll try to flesh that out. Besides attending regular public school, she went to a CP-run school in the evenings and on her summer vacation, and those songs, they came from that school. The memories she had of her family and of that period in her life were very positive. She loved to sing those old songs from her camp, especially that one that said, "We're fighting for the working class against the bourgeoisie." She learned that as a kid. Now, by the time she grew up to the point where she went to Brooklyn College, the Cold War had already begun. And she actually organized a campus protest against the Korean War, which started in 1950 when she was in school. And that took a lot of guts in those days, because Senator Joseph McCarthy was on this rampage against the left, a witch hunt that led to thousands and thousands of people losing their jobs, from professors, people in the State Department, in Hollywood, but also the factories and the offices. And others who were members of the Communist Party or participated with the Communist Party were jailed. Some even committed suicide because of what had happened. The radical movement in this country at that time was very much on the defensive, in a deep freeze that wasn't broken until the massive civil rights protests began in the South at the end of the 50s. And that it was in that kind of a climate that she came of age politically. Now, she got a degree in nursing from Yale, which I assume then was as prestigious a college as any other, as it is today. But she wasn't looking for some cushy job in healthcare. She was just looking for a way to make a living while organizing other women workers, just as a number of our nursing comrades, some in this room, have done since then. And she was looking for a Marxist organization that she could believe in. So that's when she met Artie Rosen, who she mentioned in that interview. He was a comrade who also died a few years ago, who was deeply political. He talked politics all the time, and he talked politics with Frances. And eventually, they were both recruited into the Socialist Workers' Party here in New York, and met Vince Copeland, who had come to New York from Buffalo to be an organizer here. Now, the question I want to address here is, why did she join the SWP and not the Communist Party? Well, I don't know what her parents thought about what she did, but at that time, the hostility of most people in the Communist Party to the SWP was very virulent, and likewise the other way around, too. And Frances was very much a communist, but with a small c, not a capital C, meaning not in the Communist Party. I think one of the things that may have affected her was that she could have been repelled by the move by Soviet Premier Khrushchev in February 1956 away from Leninism when he denounced Stalin. Because that denunciation was not only about Stalin and his policies, it was also a departure from Lenin's teachings on imperialism, a revision of Leninism on imperialism, a rejection of the Leninist view that the two social systems, socialism and capitalism, are incompatible. So Khrushchev's motivation in denouncing Stalin at that time, in this report that he gave to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1956, his motivation was not to move toward greater political freedom for workers in the USSR, which some may have hoped for, or to promote the world revolutionary struggle. Not at all. Khrushchev denounced Stalin as a signal to the imperialists that he didn't want to fight them. He wanted détente between the two systems. But the imperialists gave their answer. Just 8 months later, they promoted reaction in Eastern Europe and gave support to a counter-revolutionary uprising in Hungary. Now, Frances had lost most of the relatives that she had in Poland when the Nazis beat, shot, starved, and gassed millions of Jews during World War II. She knew that the so-called freedom fighters in Hungary had many fascists in their leading ranks, which we pointed out at the time. She understood the totally reactionary character of U.S. imperialism's Cold War against the socialist camp. At the time that Frances joined the SWP, there was a minority political tendency in that party led by Sam Marcy, Vince Copeland, and Dorothy Ballant, who she refers to also in this interview. And then in 1959, they would break with the SWP and form Workers' World Party, our party. They had been critical of the SWP leadership's positions for more than a decade, particularly its completely false understanding of what was happening in Europe and Asia. The SWP thought they saw a revival of what they called revolutionary socialism in Eastern Europe when these rebellions broke out. Our comrades saw reaction and counter-revolution. In other words, we were in the same party, but on opposite sides of the barricades in these struggles. The SWP was very late to recognize the proletarian class character of the Chinese and Korean revolutions. And it was soft on defending them when U.S. imperialism launched its massive war against Korea in 1950. Our tendency, on the other hand, became known as the Marcy tendency, sometimes called the global class war tendency. Our tendency saw in these revolutions the opening of a new chapter of the world class struggle for socialism. We argued for finding ways to vigorously defend those in the Communist Party who were under attack, like the Rosenbergs, who you know were executed as spies in 1953. So it was natural that Frances, who hadn't joined the Communist Party, did join our tendency in the SWP that embraced revolution and resistance to imperialism, where it was led by communist parties that the SWP had written off, like in China and Korea. Now, she read Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and she also read the works of Leon Trotsky, which she referred to there in the pamphlet, in the book, In Defense of Marxism. She really appreciated a thorough Marxist analysis of contemporary world events, instead of the factional interpretations that blamed everything on the personalities of leaders, on power struggles, personal power struggles. And then Martha told me something that Frances refers to there, that Sam asked Frances to lead some classes on basic Marxism in the Buffalo branch. Martha heard about this from Vera Spruill, who was a leading, wonderful black comrade in Buffalo, who found Frances's classes had been very valuable in her own political development, and she told that to Martha. Not long before that, the split occurred between those who were to found Workers' World and the SWP in 1959. Frances made this very big personal decision. She fell in love with Ted Dostal, a steel worker, a magnificent organizer of workers in Youngstown, Ohio. And she moved to Youngstown, a small city, from New York City, where they soon got married and Frances got a nursing job in the area. Now, she was a woman who had long been immersed in a culture of highly politicized European immigrants who were concentrated in a large cosmopolitan city, New York. But she went to gritty Youngstown, this small city, however, one of the most productive steel cities in the world at that time, fifth largest in the world. This small city was all, they had open hearths and blast furnaces, and you could, if you went there at night, the whole sky would be red from the furnaces, lighting up when they poured the molten steel. It was an incredible place. So she went there, and then later she went with Ted to Cleveland. And she soon fit in to the kind of organizing that was needed there, even though she had come from a very different background. Well, Ted was a wonderful union militant. He had hands like wood. Shaking hands with him was like an experience. He had worked hard all his political life. But he went into the steel plants after having been a teacher. He went into the steel plants to be an organizer. That came out of the 30s and his experiences. In the 30s, he was in Minneapolis when the Teamsters almost took over the city. The Teamster Rebellion in 1935 or 6. I'm not sure the exact year. And that struggle was led by SWPers in the Teamsters Union in Minneapolis, and that's one of the things that brought him to the SWP. At the time when Frances got there, I think that in many ways the steelworkers were fighting defensive battles against the bosses. These huge corporations were already looking ahead to phase out these older steel mills in the so-called, what they were to call the Rust Belt later on. And they were taking the huge profits that they had squeezed out of the workers' sweat and blood and investing it in high technology, often in other countries or even in countries, oppressed countries, where they could pay lower wages. And the Vietnam War, which came not long after, signaled the drive of these bosses to break their way into Asia as their new frontier for exploitation. In that period, the bosses were tacitly giving a lot of support to racist, far-right groups like the Nazis, the Klan, and the White Citizens Councils, organize. I mean, this thing about the Tea Party and the Koch brothers, that's nothing new, The bosses have been into this stuff for a long time. They really wanted to break up the unity of the workers in steel in places like Youngstown, where a huge proportion of the workers were black, had come, many of them directly from the South, to work in the industry of the North. And both Ted and Frances saw the struggle against racism as paramount in being able to fight back against these huge corporations. So they opposed racism and the far right head on. And both Youngstown and later Cleveland, they organized support for black revolutionaries who had run afoul of the capitalist injustice system. They sparked many protest demonstrations for Mae Mallory, who was a co-worker with Rob Williams, who she mentioned there, and was an advocate of the right of self-defense against racist terror. And she was jailed in Ohio, but threatened with extradition to North Carolina, where Rob Williams had been and where they were phony charges were drawn up against both of them. And at that time, Ted and Frances put up their house for collateral so that May Mallory could be bailed out and continue organizing. This was characteristic of their great generosity. Many workers would certainly hesitate to make such a big commitment after toiling away for many years just to have a secure roof over their head. And they did it again in 1969, when Ahmed Evans, a black nationalist, was jailed in Cleveland. And then, after being actually not even on the demonstration, but observing the demonstration, because the black organizers of a demonstration for Ahmed Evans had asked that the demonstration be just black people, so they stood on the sidelines. But Ted was arrested anyway for being there and jailed for 6 months. Anyway, Frances took over a lot of the work that they had been doing together in that period when he was in prison. You see, she hated oppression. It was seared into her by the horrendous oppression the Nazi imperialists spread across Europe. And she easily translated this into the struggle against racism in this country. But she was never fooled by the Zionist arguments that obliterated class consciousness and concealed the reactionary character of the Jewish state established in Palestine. Somehow, in the middle of all this political activity, she was able to organize the nurses at the Kaiser Community Health Foundation where she worked. And she was elected the first president of that new unit of the Ohio Nurses Association. Being in Workers' World Party was the catalyst for all she and Ted did, whether it was fighting racism, opposing imperialist wars, organizing women and men into unions and making those unions fight, going to Philadelphia to support Mumia Abu-Jamal, which they did on Ted's 90th birthday when she pushed his wheelchair through the streets of Philadelphia on that demonstration in the broiling August sun, or championing gay rights long before most of the progressive movement had caught on. Some people have this mistaken idea that being in a revolutionary party is draining, that it's something too hard for most people to do. But I hope that this short biography of Frances Sherman Dostal and the film that you saw demonstrate that really there's no better life than that of a revolutionary, in times of reaction as well as of upsurge. Frances was fortunate, and she was very happy. She was the smilingest, most warmest, greetingest person you could imagine. She was happy in having found a party that has remained true to the great revolutionary ideals and practice of the founders of communism.